Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to those of you online and to the presenters that are joining me this afternoon. I'm in the room today for this webinar on the workplace health and safety legislation that's being delivered by WALGA in conjunction with LGIS. I know I'm preaching the converted here, but Western Australia is unique as the only jurisdiction in Australia where local government is responsible for managing volunteer bushfire brigades and ensuring the health and safety of the approximately 20,000 Bushfire Brigade volunteers. The Work Health and Safety Act 2020 received royal assent in November last year, and it's expected to come into effect early in 2022, replacing the current Occupational Health, Safety and Welfare Act 94 and other associated legislation. So the purpose of this webinar today is to update local governments on the new Work Health and Safety Act, and in particular focus on its implications for the management of volunteer bushfire brigades. So before we get underway, it's appropriate that I start by acknowledging the many traditional owners of the different lands on which we work throughout Western Australia, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So look, just housekeeping, and I'm sure we're all very familiar with the housekeeping in relation to virtual meetings these days. But if you could all please mute your microphones during the presentations. During our panel discussion, our presenters will answer a number of pre-submitted questions. But if you wish to ask questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat function and we will facilitate answers being provided to you after the webinar. We expect to be quite tight with time this afternoon, so we'll hopefully get through a few questions, but we'll see how we go. The presentations that you're going to see from today's webinars will also be made available through the WALGA website. Just as a bit of context, we have over 200 registered attendees today, which I think is a really strong indication that this is a matter of some significance for the local government sector in Western Australia. So I'm really delighted that we're joined by speakers who are going to share their expertise on the related topics with us this afternoon. And so what I'd like to do is very quickly welcome and introduce Richard Burnell, who's the Executive Director, DFES Corporate Services Command, and Matthew Watson, the DFES Manager Health and Safety Services. Appearing online today, we've got Emma Horsfield, LGIS's Safety Program Manager, and Emma, let's hope the technology stacks up this afternoon. We've got Scott Wade, who's a solicitor with McLeod's Barristers and Solicitors, Paul Postma, who's the Acting District Officer Training, DFES Bushfire Centre of Excellence, and Myra Giardini, who's the Coordinator of Emergency Management from the City of Mandurah. Welcome, Myra. So look, it's my great pleasure now to hand over to Emma Horsfield, who is LGIS's Safety Program Manager, for her presentation providing an overview of the work health and safety legislation for local government, the LGIS resources and support, and managing and reducing risk. So Emma, I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, if we can go straight to the first slide, I think introductions have been well and truly done. Nick also mentioned the legislation changes. So our current legislation is the Occupational Health and Safety Act from 1984 with supported regulations from 96. As Nick indicated, the new Work Health and Safety Act was passed in November 2020 following the tragic fatality at Curtin University. The key question that's been on everybody's mind is, well, when is that going to be law abiding? And as recently as Friday last week, the updates from WorkSafe WA indicates that that's now going to be January 2022. At this stage, transition periods are still being defined, is our understanding. So I guess it's a case of just watching that space. Next slide, please. Thanks. So what's changed, if anything? Fundamentally, the duty of care to provide a safe workplace has not changed. What is in current legislation is also in future legislation. There is the introduction of a PCBU, so a person conducting a business or undertaking. There's a broader definition around a worker, which we'll talk about, but that expands to include volunteers, including Bushfire Brigade volunteers as well. There's also the introduction of due diligence requirements on officers, but really is that any different than what's in current legislation and our current obligations? And I'll touch on that slightly, and I think Scott's going to also expand on that. And then there's the introduction of industrial manslaughter provisions. And again, is that really any change? The recent prosecution of the director of MT Sheds, for example, where he was sent to prison, was actually under current legislation, not future legislation. Next slide, please. So duty of care. A person conducting a business or undertaking must, as far as reasonably practicable, ensure the health and safety of workers engaged or caused to be engaged, or activities carried out and influenced directly by a person, and a local government is classed as a PCBU. So that relates to a work environment, plant and structures, a safe system of work and safe use, handling and storage of plant and equipment, provisions of facilities for welfare, information, and the ones I've highlighted there are around training, instruction and supervision and monitoring conditions. So when it comes to our volunteers, we need to make sure that we are incorporating training into that, instruction and appropriate supervision where required. And that duty of care also extends to accommodation owned or under the control of a PCBU. Next slide, please. So the question we get asked a lot is, well, how do we meet legislation? What's the minimum standard? What do we need to do? What does reasonably practicable look like? So this is taken straight out of the standards and the codes of practice and all those supporting materials that we get. But essentially what we need to do is make sure that we understand the likelihood of the hazards and the risks that may occur, and the degree of harm that may result of that hazard or risk, and what the person knows or ought to know. So it's not enough for us to say, well, we didn't know. If we are, as an organisation, performing an activity that we are entrusted with, then we ought to know what's reasonable and what isn't. With this one, what my strongest recommendation would be that we need to make sure that any decisions are documented. We need to make sure that we have evidence to say it wasn't reasonably practicable and why it wasn't practicable. It's not enough to say, for example, we haven't got the financial resources, we haven't got the physical resources. We need to be able to demonstrate how we came to that conclusion, and the best way to do that is to record it and look at all the facts. Can I just ask you to go back one slide, please? Yeah, sorry. On this one, we mentioned training and instruction. From day one with this project, one of the key issues that and feedback that I've had from local government is that it's very, very difficult to get bushfire volunteers to training. These are people who are volunteering their time. In a lot of cases, they may be farmers who are busy on the farm. So actually getting them to any kind of training is extremely difficult. And we know that. However, each local government will need to understand how they can address that challenge and what is actually going to work for them in their area. You know your volunteers better than anyone. You know the challenges, and we need to find a workaround for that. And work out what those best mechanisms are. The resources that we produced around the Bushfire Volunteer Handbook, with the basic training information in there around what are the hazards and how should they address those, is a starting point. Its intention was it was a conversation starter for local governments to have with these volunteers. Even if we email it to them, post it to them, or ask them to come to a meeting or at one of their scheduled meetings, provide them with this resource, it opens up the dialogue around why we need to make sure that these people have the appropriate training. Thank you. If you can go back to slide 6, please. Oh, it won't be 6 for you, it's 6 for me. Next one. All right, so introduction of the term PCBU. So as I said, that's a person conducting a business or undertaking, and a local government is classed as a PCBU. And this replaces the term employer and is used to capture the broader employer entities. And we've named a few there. So companies, joint ventures, volunteer bodies, not-for-profit and sole traders, for example. And as Nick indicated, these slides will be available to you after the webinar. Next slide, please. The broader definition of a worker. For me, this has never really been any different than current legislation, apart from there's a little bit more rigor around it, around training and whatnot. But we've got workers, they are our employees. Contractors and subcontractors now come under the definition of a worker, but we have responsibilities for them under current legislation. Apprentices, same. Work experience, the same. We have a duty of care, and volunteers. So we've always had a responsibility for volunteers. It's just now there's a little bit more definition around it. Next slide, please. I've included this slide because one of the subjects that also came up predominantly when I started working on this project around bushfire brigades and volunteers was the role that elected members play. And how can we justify to elected members that we may need additional spend or we may need additional resources, etc. Now, an elected member is not classed as an officer, but this doesn't remove them of their obligations, and they are mentioned elsewhere within the Act. So they still have a responsibility and a duty of care under Section 29. And I've bullet pointed there what that means. So in practice, when an elected member fulfills their obligation in that role, including interaction and making decisions with a local government and participating in discussions and decisions, they need to consider the above. So that extends to Bushfire Brigade volunteers. Next slide, please. So duty of care obligations. So we've got duty of officers. So one of the core responsibilities that they're going to have under the new legislation is the due diligence. Due diligence is exactly as it sounds. We need to make sure that we do our due diligence, that we have the appropriate information to make the right decisions. The majority of local governments will already have some of this in place, maybe not specifically for bushfire volunteers, but that's where we need to start looking at incorporating that. The duty of care for workers, to look after their own health and that of others and comply and cooperate. So that obviously includes bushfire volunteers. And the duty of others, as we just said with the elected members, is for their own health and safety and that of others through act or omission and comply. Next slide, please. So who's an officer? So this is another topic that we've had a lot of questions on. An officer is a person who makes or participates in making decisions that affect the whole or substantial part of the business or undertaking. That doesn't, as I said, include an elected member, but they are covered under the duty of an other. So officers need to exercise due diligence to ensure that they are complying with their duty of care and obligations. Next slide. So what does due diligence look like? And as I said, I think Scott's going to also touch on this. It's about making sure that we've got up-to-date information, understanding the nature of operations and hazards and risks. That may be challenging in the bushfire space because we may have a SESM or we might not have been as closely involved with bushfire activities or the brigades. We may have limited resources. So that may be an area that we need to expand on. Provide for and use resources and processes to eliminate and minimize risk. Again, feedback has been that this could be challenging for some local governments, particularly from a financial perspective. Processing and receiving information about incidents and hazards and risks, and implementing processes and procedures to ensure that we meet our duty of care. But then also just verifying that those provisions that we've put in place are actually being used and appropriately used, more to the point. Okay, next slide. I'm conscious of time. Duty to consult with other duty holders. So this again is a crucial area that local governments need to work through with their brigades and also other stakeholders. So WHS requires that those with shared responsibilities work together to make sure that we do what's needed. And that means that it requires consultation and cooperation and coordination between all duty holders. So for me, the purpose of the WHS is to ensure that we're all working together holistically. So this is really key. For example, there may be a number of different duty holders involved in influencing how that work is carried out. So we need to make sure that we consult, we cooperate, and we coordinate those activities as far as is reasonably practicable. Now, that probably already happens in some cases on the fireground, and I'm sure it does, but I think there are areas where we can tighten up those processes a little bit more, so we have a better understanding of what's involved and who's on the ground for those stakeholders. So each must share health and safety related information in a timely manner, and make sure that we're meeting our shared health and safety obligations. Doesn't always mean that you need to agree, although each duty holder retains responsibility for discharging their health and safety duties. And as I said before, we must, as far as reasonably practicable, consult with all workers, including volunteers, about matters that directly affect them. Next slide. So what to do next? Well, let's face it, there's quite a bit to do in this space. I've been working on this project for 8 months, and I think I discover more and more every time I look at it. But the key thing that local governments need to make sure that they have in place is sufficient access to WHS resources, provide education and awareness, however best suits your local government and your brigades where needed. Ensure that Bushfire volunteers have got sufficient experience and training. Also, we had a question about equipment, making sure that equipment supplied is suitable for activities being performed, and I did provide some answers directly for that one. Reviewing your current reporting mechanisms. So if there is an incident and what happens on the fireground, are you aware? If there is a hazard, are you aware? Making sure that you've got those processes in place. So on that, to make sure that we review anything and ensure that we have provision of adequate resources, both physical and financial, in place to ensure that we're providing a safe workplace for all. I know that's challenging in some cases, but that's what we need to do. Next slide. So in terms of assistance, we've created the Bushfire Volunteer Handbook. And as I said, that's a starting point for local governments to start having those conversations with the brigades and the volunteers on some of the hazards associated with their activities. Now, we know they're going to pick that up and read it and go, well, we already know half of this. We already know most of this. But we have an obligation to start having that conversation. So this was developed as a tool for local governments who might not have anything in place as a starting point. We also developed the CEO briefing, which provides you with an overview of the WHS legislation and specifics in there. And we've also worked in collaboration with DFES to allow you to have access to training programs and records. And I know that DFES are in the room today. I'm going to be talking about that. And all of those resources are available at the moment on the LGIS portal. There are other resources that we are looking to also create. Those have kindly been supplied to us by the City of Mandurah. And there's a number of those resources that we think can benefit other local governments. So they will be coming soon as well. Okay, next slide. So how long have we got? As we've said already, Nick said, and I touched on as well, regulations are still under development. WorkSafe have indicated January 2022 to commence, but at the moment we don't know what the transition periods are going to be. So that is a case of watch that space. And I think that's my last slide. If you just go next slide. There was a question. Do you want me to answer that? You want me to have a look at that?
We'll park the questions till the end.
Are you going to park them? Okay, cool. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Emma. And look, that was really authoritative. I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. And in the interest of sort of keeping the session moving, I'm going to hand over now to Richard Burnell, who's the Executive Director of Corporate Services Command at DFES. Richard's going to provide an overview on the work that DFES is doing to respond to the WHS legislation. And very quickly, I'd like to acknowledge the support that Richard has provided to the local government sector and his advocacy, particularly in relation to regional telecommunications over a period of time. So looking forward to your presentation. Thank you, Richard.
All right, thanks, Nick. And thank you, Emma, for a really comprehensive overview and just calling out the high shots for us. And so the first slide, actually, in the presentations of both Nick and Emma, we've already covered that there, so it's just a matter of reinforcing what's already been said. Just to let you know that we've already reached out to the State Solicitor's Office to also get some guidance, because as you will be well aware, DFES has 6 services that it covers and provides support for. And there are instances where state emergency services are engaged or enacted to go and provide some support under the direction of the Hazard Management Authority, which is WA Police. So we've been asking questions over, well, who's the person conducting the business undertaking when it's a search and rescue, for example. We end up with Volunteer Marine and Rescue, where there's 2 sets of legislation covering their operations, whether they're onshore or offshore. So we've been seeking some clarification from the State Solicitor with that respect. And then we end up with the Bushfire volunteers, where traditionally you might have a fire that starts on a farming property that may well be self-contained, and the farmer responds and addresses all of the issues and does it satisfactorily. Then there might be an instance where the Bushfire Control Officer is contacted because the fire is getting out of control, or it might be one that's been subject to a permit. What's the role and responsibility of local government versus the farmer when there's that instance? Then you end up with the Section 13 transfers, where it might be a fire that Parks and Wildlife have had, where they want to transfer that to DFES, or there's a major fire that just DFES is enacted by the local government. So what we've done to try and facilitate some conversation around that, and I'm just going to flip through a couple of slides, is just, we've got 2 slides and it just paints some different scenarios. And what I'm hopeful that this does is it just maybe crystallizes some more questions that you would have, so that Scott can provide some specific response, because I know Scott's well experienced in a lot of these issues, having come from the East and gone through the whole Harmonisation Act transformation process before. And we've got Paul from our Bushfire Centre of Excellence, who is going to talk about all of the training materials that we specifically developed. In response to a statement, Emma, that you made where you've got some feedback, where you end up with some of the Bushfire Brigade members who are reluctant to go through the formal training because it's difficult to get access to the systems, or it takes a lot of time and they haven't got those time periods available. What Matt's been doing, and Matt, this might be something that you work on in conjunction with Emma, is we've been thinking about some induction materials, particularly around major incidents or level 2 incidents, or just minor incidents, where it helps people who haven't done the formal training, but the person who's controlling the incident effectively wants to have some induction so that they've addressed a duty of care to say, this is the way I run my incident or my fireground. So we're going to do some preparation materials just to help in that process. That's something that's clearly going to be available for local government. And as Emma referenced on her second last slide, I think there's also all of the training materials that DFES has. So local government can feel confident that all the materials that we've got that we develop for training, they're all proven, because we go through and we reference those when we are actually in response mode and managing fires. And whenever there's a review process that highlights that there needs to be an adjustment made to the doctrine that's published, that's a process that we support. So you know that they're contemporary training materials and operating procedures, and they're all available for local government use. So in terms of just this scenario, so it maps out where you might have a farmer who might be doing some harvesting, for example, and he may have his own farm response unit just sitting close by to the harvesting operations, because that's his normal risk management practice. And the harvester might strike a rock and set off a small fire in the stubble, but his farm response unit will go through and address the fire. They can extinguish it. The local government may not know anything about that instance. In that case, The farmer is responsible for all of the workers that he has on his property. He's the one responsible for the way the incident's being managed. He has to record all the information in terms of his duty of care to his employees. And in terms of the Work Health and Safety Act, he's the individual conducting the business undertaking. And so therefore that duty of care has always been his and still remains his. Then you'll end up with, if the farmer says, well, or believes that he wants to make the local government aware, because it could be that the wind conditions are about to change and he's not confident that he'll be able to manage and contain the fire. So he might contact the local bushfire control officer or the local government and say, I want some support, please. Then you'll end up with the scenario where there's a shared responsibility. And I'm sure that Scott will be able to talk to this. Because local government will say, well, I've got my bushfire volunteers, so I'll activate those brigades to come, or I'll come and inspect before I determine which brigades are going to be called out by me. So it would be that bushfire control officer who's primarily responsible for the duty of care for the brigade members. But if the farmer is still directing his internal farmer response team to go through and do fire response on his property, then he still has a duty of care to his farm response team and his farm workers. So there's a shared responsibility, and I'm sure, Scott, you might pick the bones out of that, because some examples may well have cropped up in the East Coast where that's been tested. And then, of course, you end up with an escalation where the local government says, well, you know, we want to transfer this through to DFIS, or as we've indicated there, there's a Parks and Wildlife fire where they want to transfer the ownership and responsibility through to Section 13. It still means that there are shared responsibilities for each of the worker groups that are involved in attacking the fire and doing the mop-up operations afterwards. Again, it just still reinforces the duty of care that we've always had, but it does bring it into sharper perspective in terms of what the obligations and responsibilities are. So I'm sure there's always grey areas around the transition process, Scott, which you might talk to, but that's one example. So that all of those are essentially fires that have just not been driven out of a planned initiative. These are all unplanned events, versus the next series of scenarios which may create some different circumstances, where there might be a burning permit that's issued, and it could be that the bushfire control officer understands the location where the fire is going to be conducted. The farming operation may well have really good quality risk management practices, procedures, good assets, all the staff that are trained. So it could be that the bushfire control officer says, I'm happy that you control that, so I approve you to go through and conduct the burn. Versus another permit where it's agreed that there needs to be local government support, so the brigade has to be there to provide some support to make sure that if it does get out of hand, they can control it. So there's either an individual responsibility to the farmer, because he's been acknowledged as being able to manage the whole undertaking without any assistance. But if it is one that needs some support from the local government, there's a shared responsibility, but they focus on their own resources. And then obviously, if it's going to be escalated through into DFIS under the Section 13 transfer, then DFIS steps in and it's got a responsibility to all the individuals. So I'm hoping that just those two basic scenarios with the little nuances about what happens as the fire starts to transition from maybe a farm property into local government property into Crown land, what that means and who has responsibility. So I'm hoping that raises some questions. So in terms of just the work in progress within DFIS, so as we've alluded to, Matt is going through making sure that we're reviewing all of our safety management system, because as you know, we've got our recording mechanism in place so that where there are incidents, we know who's on the ground, who's been affected. We can track it from exposure hours perspective. We've got obligations for fatigue management, so making sure that we've got all our processes and the systems that will support proper duty of care distribution to the individuals involved. Matt's also establishing health and safety leaders at local BGUs, and I think that was referencing the point that Emma had made.
Absolutely.
And then we're continuously reviewing and improving all our policies and procedures. So we've got some elements there that are just highlight some of the internal work that we're doing. Just the key messages for you, and forgive us in terms of the use of the word regional, but there are a lot of people that already really understand this deeply because it's ingrained in their DNA. The SESMs, the DFIS area officers, the bushfire control officers, the district officers. There's a whole raft of people that really understand bushfire management and emergency management practices inside out. And they're all available to assist. So any local government that's got any questions or concerns, if their internal staff aren't able to help, then they just pick up the phone to the local DFIS district officer or area officer. We're making a point that they do get out and meet with all of the local governments so that if there's any questions or any issues that are emerging, they can determine how we can provide some assistance. We've mentioned the operational procedures before that are available and the training materials, which Paul is actually going to talk a little bit more to. So I'm hoping that that's helpful, and I've given you back a little bit of time there.
You've given us a couple of minutes, Richard, so I'm very grateful for that. And look, the contextual scenarios you provided there were really valuable, so appreciate that. And it's a good segue because we're now going to hand over to Scott Wade. So I'd like to introduce Scott, who's a partner practicing in occupational health and safety and work health and safety law with McLeod's barristers and solicitors. Scott's going to expand on the due diligence aspects of the WHS legislation and how local government can meet their obligations under the Act. We really appreciate your time, Scott.
Thanks very much. Firstly, excuse my voice, everybody, but I assure everyone I'm not infectious. It's just an alluring voice. One thing I will touch on, first of all, is I'm actually from WA, and I went over there to work to the East Coast, so don't hold that against me, and I've returned. So, but as Richard pointed out, I rolled out the same legislation on the East Coast in 2012 for a large-scale organisation, so I've certainly felt the nuances and the pain of this transition, and that included for an emergency service. The key changes really under this Act are personal liability. Historically, you've only been able to charge a person if you successfully also charged an organisation. That's no longer the case. You can prosecute an individual in the absence of charging an organisation. So that's a significant change. The requirement to consult has never been an express requirement. Again, failure to do so can result in prosecution. And the other really, this is aside from the duties of officers, the other really I guess you would say tactile change that will be felt on the ground level will be the increased reporting that you're required to do to a regulator. That is an exponential increase. You will be contacting them more regularly. You don't want to over-report. You don't want to under-report. You need to know what to report and when to report it and have a process for doing that. There are now 2 categories and 26 subcategories for reporting. And remember that that's mandated. Then keep that in the back of your mind when you're thinking about Bush Fire Brigade arrangements and how many of them there are, and the fact that they also have to, as your employees, report things immediately to the regulator. So that is going to take up a fair bit of your resources when you're transitioning to the new provisions of the Act and regs. So we've sort of touched on already who is an officer. The main focus here is forget job titles. The Act doesn't reference job titles, it references decision-making and influence. So this is about people who can bring about real change in the organisation. And it's about that change impacting safety. Think about the scale of somebody's portfolio, regardless of their job title. Sometimes in smaller local governments, regardless of whether they're considered to be a director or an executive, they do have a significant role, a highly significant role in decision-making and passing of budgets, etc. This also can fluctuate. If somebody is not an officer, generally speaking, however, they lead a large-scale project such as a restructure, an organisational restructure, that carries significant risk, and it also impacts the whole of the organisation. So you might need to consider during that period, do they become an officer? If you have a method, perhaps a matrix or a tool for identifying who these people are in relation to, you know, the easy wins, which are the executive, and then the transitioning when people act up, etc. And we've also touched on the fact that elected members are not officers, although they do have a role to play in decision making. So that's a practical reality. The key features of the obligations is that they are positive, they're proactive. You must go out and do stuff. You can't sit back and leave it to the safety person or leave it to the SESM. That's not how this works. And that will, in all likelihood, result in a breach in terms of a failure to actually proactively inform yourself. They are ongoing. They require refresher training, ongoing maintenance of the knowledge, the obligations, the discharging of the duties. As I said before, they are personal in liability. You can delegate tasks. You cannot delegate liability. So that's a key concept. And a breach, as I said before, can result in just failing to undertake one of these steps. And that has actually occurred. Failing to inform themselves, an officer failing to inform themselves of what could be done to mitigate a risk on the East Coast resulted in a prosecution, a successful prosecution. This is my fancy diagram that summarises the 6 elements of due diligence. So that's pretty self-explanatory. So we'll move through each of those just quickly. Element 1 is to acquire and keep up-to-date knowledge of WHS matters, including the law. Now, this doesn't mean you need to be an expert. This is about understanding what is WHS, how does it relate to my organisation. So keep in mind, our context today is volunteer Bushfire Brigades. So what is WHS in relation to volunteer Bushfire Brigades? And what do I need to know? As I said, you don't need to be an expert, but you will need to do some practical things, training, briefing sessions, make sure that you undertake some refreshers as well. It's not a set and forget. It needs to be specific to the scenario, which in this case, volunteers. You could also assist in covering off this obligation through things like regular reports. Use your SESMs, use your safety advisors. Make sure you include legislative and case law updates. Have there been any prosecutions relevant to volunteers and fire brigades? Have there been incidents? This is a big one. Excuse me. Understanding the operations and risks of the volunteer bushfire brigades. Now, the fundamental thing with this is that you wouldn't run any other business without getting out and having a look at the business and how it operates. So why would you run volunteer bushfire brigades having never attended, having never gone to a meeting, having never gone and had a look at training, having never spoken to the people about what risks they've got, whether their resources are adequate? This is just like any other facet of a business. Get out there and inform yourself and attend some of those meetings. Ask the questions. The volunteers know the answers. The challenge for you as an officer is to get out there and get it off them. You cannot rely on this being the safety person's responsibility. They already know about it. It's the officers that don't. I will point out too, this relates to all officers, not the person who has safety in their portfolio. This relates to HR, this relates to finance. All of those people can indirectly impact safety, even right all the way down to the safety of these volunteers. So you've got to make sure that they are treated like every other facet of your business. Enter their hazards into your risk register when you go out and have a look and you find out what they are. Make sure they've got a reporting system when you go out there. Have a look, ask the questions, and include the reports about their safety and their hazards in your regular scheduled executive reports, not just your health and safety committee, because odds are your executive, all of your officers are not on that committee. So resources and processes. The sort of the 3 slides that are really significant here are 2, 3, and 4. So element 3, ensuring the provision of resources and processes to eliminate and mitigate risk. As Emma touched on, this means human resources, expertise, so knowledge, financial and equipment. There is something that I normally touch on, which is an accident that occurred on the East Coast that was significant. It was a triple fatality in an emergency service I worked for. And that resulted from a lack of expertise and a failure to identify that there wasn't enough in-house expertise to identify the hazards. So it's real, and it resulted in a prosecution that was successful. You need to make sure that there are also procedures that are suitable. Lots of procedures doesn't equal good. They need to be appropriate. Do they work? When you go and visit that site, ask. Go and ask, see if they're being used in training. Ask the volunteers. Again, when the regulator asks, they will be told. Now, you also need to understand, out of those resources and processes, what do you provide and what do DFS provide and what do other people provide? You have to know as an officer, because you own this risk now. All of you, you can't rely on others. Ask your members, do you have any in-house expertise who can help inform this information? If you don't have in-house expertise, maybe you need to go and get that expertise. It could be a contractor. It could be somebody else that you ask. It could be DFS. Consult with them. They've got the knowledge. Review your incident reports, and most importantly, ask why. Why does this thing keep occurring? Is it because we don't have appropriate resources? I would caution anybody who keeps getting reports that say human error. Generally speaking, humans and volunteers, any emergency services worker, are very good at their job. They're very good at doing workarounds, and they usually work around poor procedures or something along those lines. So dig deeper, scratch the surface. Very rarely is it human error. Element 4, receive the information and respond to it. I've obviously abbreviated these or shortened these, but ensure that you've got a process. Fundamental to this, aside from having a process which might be an electronic reporting system, which is very fancy to have, if you don't have a good reporting culture, you're never going to hear this information. Odds are things are happening, not odds are, factually, things occur. They're occurring right now. They're occurring as they train. They're occurring as they respond. You just may or may not be hearing about them. They're not good, bad, or indifferent, but you need to hear about them. Now, you also have these increased reporting requirements, and you can't comply if you don't know about them. If you drive reporting culture underground, no matter how good your system, you will fail. So this must be real, and it must be driven by the officers. So encourage it, reward it, be creative. Be aware that your fancy electronic reporting system may not be suitable for your volunteer fire brigades. There is nothing in the legislation, and I can tell you the regulations are the same, that will say you must use the same system across the board in your organisation, or you must use an electronic system. All you need to do is make sure it's reported on, make sure it's consistent, and make sure you know about the things that are occurring, and you can actually make the appropriate notifications to regulators, respond to the risks, etc. So you may have a paper-based system, you may have a telephone-based system that is more appropriate for the volunteer brigades and volunteers, and can be then entered into your electronic system later. So consult, you have to do it, consult, ask the question, does it work? Ongoing legal compliance. Again, it's not set and forget. Laws change, your operational requirements change, DFS's situations change, their resources change. You need to make sure that you undertake these reviews. One thing I would say is people are really good at telling people that they're really good at doing things. Organisations typically don't want to tell themselves that they're doing something relatively poorly. So try and get a level of independence when it comes to legal reviews. In regard to that triple fatality, there'd been audits done, countless audits done, and we were fantastic at telling each other that everything was in place until we found out it wasn't. Confirmation bias is a real thing. We're very good at doing that. So that can be scheduled, or it can be triggered by an event, a change. That event could be something like legislation, regulation changes, codes of practice, all of those things will happen. Verification is different to legal compliance. Verification relates to, well, I've gone and put all these things in place. I've got a reporting system. I've given you resources. You've asked for them. Incidentally, you haven't arbitrarily just refused the resource request, which is critical that you don't do. So now, are they using it? Is it being used as you intended? Go out, have a look, ask the question. Consider a 3-tiered approach, which is something that I've utilised before. I'm not saying this is what you have to do, but it could start locally, inspections, checklists, etc. Scale up, perhaps use your CESMs, somebody independent or relatively independent from the actual brigades. And then you could consider something like an external audit. This is again a conformance audit, not legal compliance. And you might look at standardising or obtaining accreditation to standards. The other thing I just will say quickly, legal compliance audits, you may also wish to get those done under legal professional privilege, because you are identifying a compliance deficiency potentially. So be very aware that in doing that, that can be used as evidence in a prosecution. So can casual conversations in WorkSafe liaison visits. So be aware of that. This was touched on before, co-duty holders. To put everything else to rest with regard to PCBUs, the local government is the PCBU of the volunteers. Can't dance around that. If it was established under the Bushfires Act by the local government, the volunteers are your workers under the Act. That never changes. The only thing that does change is the degree to which you control or influence the thing that's occurring. But they will always be your workers. You just have a tactical difference in how you can actually influence that. But you still have to be comfortable as their employer that the person taking over the response is going to handle things in a way that you're comfortable for your workers to be handled. So that's where that upfront discussion, that cooperation, coordination comes in. Relevance to this, obviously, we've got the transition during incidents, but we've also got things like training. Who tells you what to do in training? There is material out there that's provided by DFES. Do you use it? Don't you use it? Is it good, bad? Do you know? You need to inform yourself. This is on you. Appliances, how do you get them? We know they're funded through the scheme. They can be, or you can buy them. Same with equipment, same with PPE. Don't forget, they are your workers and you need to now know, not the SESM just know, but you need to know why things are being requested, why they may or may not have been provided. And if they haven't been provided, can you still confidently respond and keep your workers in a safe workplace in the absence of that stuff? So there's my takeaway points. Identify officers, understand your Bush Fire Brigades, ongoing duties to the volunteers, they're your workers, positive reporting culture, that one's critical, reporting, verification, etc. That one, none of those are a surprise. I did just want to touch on the issue of the assumption that you can walk away from the responsibility at any point in the process, even if DFES take over, sorry, I shouldn't say take over, transition control into a position of control at an incident. You must establish that you're comfortable for your firefighters to respond, your volunteers. The conversation in the room today that I must admit I hadn't heard previously was around the training of the volunteers and the difficulty that you have in perhaps getting them to attend or their time poor, etc. Be that as it may, you own that risk. And you need to make a decision based on that and that operational reality. Are you comfortable with that? Or are you going to try and come up with a creative way to work around that? I'm by absolutely no means saying you shouldn't use these people or do anything different to what you're doing, but be aware of it, be comfortable, you own that risk. Don't pretend you don't. That's all from me.
Scott, thanks very much. And I think even just in the summation there, you've captured why this is so nuanced and you know what some of the challenges are that obviously a significant proportion of our sector are trying to work through at the moment. So look, there was great value in that presentation, and I think you're happy to share those slides with
absolutely yes.
So
and any questions, I'm happy to field too.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for that. So thank you to Scott. We're now going to hand over to Paul Postma. So Paul is the acting DO of training at the DFES Bushfire Centre of Excellence, and Paul's going to present on the training and support that that they will provide for volunteer bushfire brigades. So over to you, mate.
Thank you, Nick. So just touching on the Bushfire Centre of Excellence and introducing who we are up front. So we came out of part of the Rural Fire Division and come out of a number of reviews that have resulted in the Bushfire Centre of Excellence, and particularly the training team. And from a local government perspective, a number of our training team is made up of former local government or former bushfire volunteers, with 3 former chief bushfire control officers on board. So we have a very good understanding of the risks that you currently face and an understanding of the process of training of volunteers. So first of all, our training, our objective is to promote and provide accessible and hands-on bushfire management training, and that's across the whole state of Western Australia. A number of our trainers are subject matter experts, and those subject matter experts are your volunteers that you currently have out in local government land. And the key outputs we have are to support and deliver accessible training for all of the volunteers. And I'm going to touch a little bit later on some of the things we have in the pipeline for online training. We're developing new courses and refreshing the existing training courses. We're endeavouring to improve access to the existing courses and existing network of trainer assessors. And we're doing a lot of work to upskill the trainers and assessors and provide them with additional products and supportive products to assist them to deliver good quality training products to the volunteers. This first course I'm going to touch on is called Bushfire Fundamentals. This course is currently going through its final quality assurance process. So it hasn't actually hit the market as yet, but it's only a week or two off at this stage. And the course is aimed at non-firefighting personnel. It comes out of an existing legacy course, which was wildfire awareness course, and it's updated to truly be contextualised to Western Australia legislation, and it's aimed at, from local government point of view, for incident support group personnel, so those coming to assist at incidents, and it's going to talk about the role of the incident management structures that we use, the reporting, what the different fire agencies' responsibilities and roles with regards to bushfire response are. There's a good section in there on bushfire characteristics, behaviour, as well as safety and survival procedures for those that are coming to assist at the bushfire, but not actually actively suppressing the bushfire. It's also aimed at the likes of Western Power, WA Police and Department of Defence that will assist us in a number of roles. This one here, Rural Fire Awareness, is one that's been developed due to the request of local governments, particularly local governments that have farmer response brigades, those brigade members that don't necessarily have official fire appliances, so they respond in their own farmer appliances, but they are Bushfire Brigade members and they have a certain level of training. It is based very much on the other product, Bushfire Fundamentals. The key difference is it now has an additional session on it, which is aimed at identifying strategies, tactics and taskings to allow those farmer response units to work in conjunction with the fire agencies, but also have an understanding of some of the terminology and some of the skills and tactics that we use. So whilst this is also under the quality assurance stage, it's imminent for release. And both of these two products, Bushfire Fundamentals and Rural Fire Awareness, will be available to the current existing trainer assessors out there that deliver training to the volunteers. So they'll be able to do these one-day courses. They are both one-day courses, and you can choose to do one or the other depending on the audience that you have. So now we get on to the official DFES Bushfire Brigade training strategy. So this is what we do for our staff, and this is our recommendation that we believe local government should do for their Bushfire Brigade. So that's your local level induction process. So bring them on board, put them through your OSH procedures, talk about the issues that you have locally. Then they do the AIMS awareness course. The AIMS awareness course is an online course. Most people it takes less than an hour, some people up to 2 hours, and that just gives them an understanding of the incident management structures that we utilise as fire services across Western Australia. We then go on to the Bushfire Safety Awareness training course, which is made up of 3 modules I'll touch on shortly, followed by the Firefighting Skills training course, which is made up of also a number of modules, going through to advanced bushfire fighting and crew leader courses. And then we move on to our incident controller pathways, which have specific courses for sector commanders, fire control officers and incident controllers that are operating at a higher level than the brand new volunteers. So the first training product, the Bushfire Safety Awareness, is made up of 3 modules. The first of those being Bushfire Characteristics and Behaviour. This training product talks very much about bushfire itself, so how fire comes about, the fire triangle. We talk about how we can do certain things to combat fire, the impacts of terrain, topography and weather at a very low level for the introduction to the brand new firefighters. And from there, they move on to bushfire safety and survival. So now we start talking about the risks that volunteers face when they respond to fires. So whether they be actual fire hazards from the fire itself or electricity, the impacts of weather, the impacts of other things such as drug labs that may be in the bush, as well as keeping hydrated and the actual personal welfare and the importance on that. These 2 particular courses, the first 2 are theory-based and they can be delivered with a trainer ratio of 1 trainer to 16 students. So you can target quite a lot of people on these training courses. The bushfire characteristics and behaviour takes approximately 4 hours, and bushfire safety and survival takes between 5 and 6 hours. These 2 courses, we are currently exploring options to make them online training products. So that will also assist local government to get these first 2 out, the theory-based ones, and get new brigade members up to a certain level before they come and start doing some of the practical training. That then moves on to the suppressed bushfire course. That is a theory and practical course. So it can't be delivered wholly online, given that it's got a practical element to it as well. This course is approximately 6 hours when done correctly and following all the activities. So all 3 of these courses we recommend will take 1 weekend or 2 full days of training. So suppressed bushfire talks a lot about the strategies, tactics and taskings that new firefighters will be faced with when responding to wildfire. And it touches a little bit on prescribed burning, but it is very much focused on responding to wildfire. This course here is our recommended minimum standard for support personnel for attending prescribed burns or wildfires. And when I say that, I'm referring to our state emergency service volunteers that come and assist us on the fire ground, but don't actually take on the active suppression. We then move into our next modular training product, which is called Firefighting Skills. This is not just for bushfire volunteers. This is aimed at fire volunteers in various different elements across the state. We have a couple of mandatories, first of all, in order to get this competency, and that is the introduction to communications and the introduction to map reading. Again, they are both theory courses, so they're reasonably quick to deliver. Map reading is 2.5 hours and introduction to communications is 3 hours. Introduction to communications is not just about our emergency service radio that we use. It touches on other elements of communication. So the use of satellite phones, the use of local radio networks, the use of UHF radio networks with farmer response units and all the other elements of communication. So it does not replace our WALGA training product that currently exists out there. Tools and equipment is very much a practical module of this course. So whilst it's a mandatory one, it has a couple of elements within it that aren't mandatory. So what we mean by that is the tools and equipment that your fire appliance and your brigade use are what you train them in. So if you don't have an urban response brigade and you don't have ladders, then you don't need to do the ropes and ladders element of the training products, and you'll only deal with the actual tools and equipment that you are currently equipped with. The other 2 that fall in here are the crew protection and the ropes and ladders. So as touched on, ropes and ladders is the non-mandatory that came out of the tools product. Crew protection is not mandatory because not all fire appliances have the full gamut of crew protection. So it does, however, cover the deluge system, the in-cab air, the radiant heat shields, the burn over blanket procedures, and the AVL and emergency distress button processes. Whilst it's not mandatory, it's highly recommended that brigade members operating on fire appliances do the whole scheme. And that's based on if they actually go out for a deployment to another part of the state, they may be operating on a fire appliance that's fitted with those crew protection. So it's just a good idea to have an understanding of those. Assist with Planned Burning is a brand new course that we've developed, and this is a link from these early level courses of bushfire safety awareness and firefighting skills to give a little bit more knowledge and understanding to brigade members, newer brigade members, about the process of applying fire to the landscape and give them a bit of actual fire behaviour knowledge. And this is an element that people will need to do in order to get up to the future plan prescribed burning course, which hopefully will come out early next year. Got a couple of advanced courses. So advanced firefighting is very much an existing course, but it's been revamped, and it's a one-day course designed to equip experienced volunteers with a better understanding of fire characteristics, give them a good understanding of the different processes that are in place, and also how to lead crews and do additional advanced fire activities. Crew leader is the first step in the leadership style, where they learn how to manage their crews, how to give direction, give good quality briefings, make decisions, but not necessarily be in control of the incident. Machine supervision is a revamped course. It's very much aimed at guiding machines during bushfires. It is not an operator's course. So I need to stress that. I have had conversations with local government, and DBCA offer a similar course, which is a 2-day course, which is called Fireline Construction, and that is aimed at machine operators, whereas ours is aimed at volunteers that are giving instructions to machinery operating on the fire ground. 2 more specialist courses that very much respond to local government requirements. The first one being Fire Control Officer. Fire Control Officer hasn't been reviewed in a significant period of time. It is being reviewed right now. And the intent of that product is now to touch on the Fire Control Officer's legislative powers and requirements, as well as the issues around permit issuing for local government officers, whether they be for enforcement and those that have had their powers limited by the local government to permit only or to legislative. And we're taking the incident management side of it out, because that's now covered in the incident controller level 1. And from a local government staff point of view, it wasn't necessarily relevant. Now we've got those 2 products, they run side by side. Fire Weather 1 is a brand new product that we've released earlier this year, and we've delivered that in a number of places across the state. And that's teaching volunteers how to understand the impacts that weather has on fire, and gives them a good understanding of what to look for, what the fire's doing, when the fire's making its own weather. Being mindful of time, I'll go straight on to our publications. We have a whole raft of publications, and probably one really relevant to local government is the new Burn Smart process that we've put out. There's a number of resources. There's websites on the DFES website about the Burn Smart, and we have a whole heap of videos that are attached to that. So you can go out to your community and say, if you're planning on burning your own property, here's a really good guide with some interactive videos and burning fact sheets. And that's my time, so thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. There was a lot to get through, and you did very well to do it in 15 minutes. So we really appreciate you being on task. We're now going to move on to our last presenter for this afternoon. And I'd like to introduce Myra, who's the Coordinator of Community Safety at the City of Mandurah. Myra is going to be presenting on the City of Mandurah's experience in promoting and supporting safety for bushfire volunteers. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, WALGA and LGIS, for the invitation to join in this presentation today. Sorry, Nick, a little correction. Coordinator of Emergency Management. So I've been in this role for 10 years, and I'm responsible for running the Local Emergency Management Committee, the Bushfire Advisory Committee, major bushfire mitigation works, including prescribed burns, and for the administration and oversight of the local government grant funds for the SES of about 90 members, major SES, and the Bush Fire Brigade of 25 members. Supporting the Bush Fire Brigade and SES is considered core business for us at the City of Mandurah as part of my role, and I do report on that bi-monthly, which is often shared with LEMC and BFAC, so they get an idea of what the issues are. I think it also is a great way to show everything else that you do and capture that. To put things in context, get this around right. So we have only just one brigade. I've been with the city 25 years, and initially back then we had 4 brigades. 3 of those have now turned into volunteer fire and rescue volunteer units, so in those gazetted fire areas. So 1 brigade, Mandurah Southern Districts, 25 members. So I'm basically, they are the first responders to Bouvard, Heron and Lake Clifton, which is about 87 square kilometres. So you can imagine it's quite a small patch to many of you, and I know that many of you probably a lot more volunteer units underneath you. So our brigade also regularly respond to campaign fires around the state, more recently the Esperance, Balladonia and Wirraloo fires. So it's important to understand they're not just in that little patch, they're actually going all over the state and often putting their hands up to be deployed interstate as well. So today I'm going to touch on the recruitment process and how important it is to actually understand what they do, how we adapted our existing local government processes to suit the volunteers, and a relationship between bushfire risk and associated controls such as the DFAS training programs. And I'm also going to touch on the funding arrangements we have. So step 1 in their recruitment process is that they actually would just let volunteers to come in and kind of get a feel for it. You know, 3 sessions come in, and a while back we discovered that there was no paperwork done at that stage, which for me was a little bit concerning, because if something happened, we had nothing on record. So we shifted the sign-up process around a little bit, and so step 1 is actually the first day they come in as an interested party, they fill out a medical declaration. So we've got an idea of any medical concerns that they might have. We do very much allow the brigade to manage the recruitment process themselves. At the end of the day, there's a huge amount of training and time and mentoring that goes into supporting these volunteers. And they're really the experts in that field, not myself, operationally. So we support them through that process. So I've said there that we amend the process as well. So recently we've amended it. So day 1, step 1, they now get a copy of the new booklet put out by WALGA and LGIS. We printed 50 copies, $200, gave 40 to the brigade, and I said, give everyone a copy. This is step 1, a reminder, and from now on, anyone coming through the door, day 1, they get a copy of this booklet. For me, it's almost like a relief to be able to provide that. A take-home copy for them to have a good read about what they're looking at getting into, and also obviously covering our butts. So so the medical declaration obviously captures those known concerns, and it can give the officers a bit of an idea of things to look out for. It's also a way for them to monitor through that process and get a feel for the volunteer as to whether they would be suitable, because we know that not all applicants will be physically or mentally equipped to be long-term volunteers in bushfire. Okay, so step 2 is basically the LG sign-up stage. So this is after 3 station visits and training. This is a bit of a try before you buy. They come along, do that. Then they fill out the forms. So it used to be 2 forms, a local government form that we helped develop for the brigade, and then there was the DFAS forms. So we've actually working with our district officer, he actually suggested that another local government had combined these 2 forms, and so we've done that working with the brigade and with Terry, our district officer, to actually come up with a great solution. But it also highlights the recruitment process that's actually noted on the form. So it's actually a four-step process within the forms. The voluntary police check is actually form 4. So this is also an important stage for the volunteer to realise that it's not all about lights and sirens and adrenaline rush, because initially, well, that's what they see on the news and that's what they think it's about. But the reality is there's a lot of time and preparation and training and practical theory, online training that is required, as you've heard. And also the reality that is often when they are deployed to fires, it might only be in mop-up. So if they're wanting to be on the front line, right in the heat of it, and it might not happen for a very long time until they're actually got a fair bit of skill behind them. So step 3 is basically after the 3 training sessions, the Bush Fire Brigade officer group has approved the member. The presentation of a satisfactory police clearance form. Then the final form is completed. It's basically a tick the boxes and refer to DFIS and the local government. That is then forwarded through the district officer, and a ID number is allocated. They then become part of that local government Bushfire Brigade monthly reporting process, which comes through each month, and we see how many incidents they've been to and whether anybody's contact details need changing. So there's a clear connection between local government and Bushfire and DFIS that some of you may not be aware of. And then from that point on, obviously both DFIS and local governments are providing support to those units. Okay, so I'm now going to just touch on how we've adapted some of our processes. Obviously, often through adversity does come growth, and we did have some issues a few years ago where there was a couple of headbutts going on and a few behavioural issues. And it came to kind of my attention that, you know, some of these guys, you know, that they are tradies and they haven't always been brought up in the corporate sector and been exposed to corporate governance and risk and inductions and things like that. So we adapted our 140 slide induction process for this city to, you know, extracting 25 slides that really hit the nail on the head for our volunteers. An example of conflict of interest that we use with the volleys is where a developer may approach the volunteer Bushfire Brigade and ask them to come in and do a massive burn, you know, like a big windrow burn, but it actually may be against environmental protection rulings, and that has been a situation like that in the past. Obviously, equal opportunity, the face-to-face element, the fact that everything that they do out there and what they say is a reflection on both the city, DFIS, their brigade themselves. And if they want to be a brigade member under the city, then they need to understand our rules. So, so basically, that's just a very small sample of that process. Oh, and also I might just mention that things have obviously changed in 10 years. We're no longer members are able to turn up in their thongs and stubbies and roll out to a fire like that. There are some basic standards now, and they often have to comply with that. So we also assisted the brigade some years ago in developing their own station induction. From memory, this was based on one that a district officer had told me about. I think it came from Wanneroo, and then we've adapted it to suit our volunteers. And obviously it covers all those different aspects of the brigade. And the rules that they have there, their expectations, their call out and the communications procedures and things like that. So that's just a small sample of what they have. Okay, in terms of City of Mandurah processes, obviously we have our workplace OSHA inspections. Recently, we've actually adapted that for the brigade. They have a brand new facility that shouldn't have too many issues now compared to their old one. And so with the discussion with the captain, he has actually agreed that he will actually run these inspections once a month, or have another member go through it with him, and then they'll report to us any issues. The example here is actually a current outstanding hazard that we're dealing with, from going from the old station up the top there down to the new one, which is actually at the lower end. We had an old set of steps, and when the new sets of steps were added to the bottom, it resulted in a riser being out of whack with the other one. So it actually created a bit of a risk in terms of, you know, trip and fall hazard. So this has now been reported, gone into our work order system. So like any other job reported to the city, it's rated there in terms of OSH risk. And I also logged it into our health and safety kind of register as well. So it's captured there. It's now the onus is on our works and services team to assess that risk and decide how they're going to best treat it. So, and in the meantime, those steps are closed off and the brigade members are encouraged to walk around or park at a different location behind the station. I must say that in terms of incident reporting, the brigade is pretty good. Sometimes their near misses don't always get reported and I have to pull that out of them, and you might find that that near miss was a little bit more than they wanted to admit to. And I do feel it is in my role to be quite relentless in that sense and persistent, and I make sure that we actually get all the evidence that we need to cover ourselves in that and encourage them to report them upfront and properly with the detail that's required. Again, adapting a city of manager process, our internal risk register, down the bottom there, bottom left-hand corner, you'll see I've circled administration. So this is my own admin team and our bushfire mitigation officer, some of the risks that we captured there. And then we put another overlay adjusting to the bushfire risk. So many of the things that we actually mentioned earlier in terms of heat stress and fatigue and things like that are captured there. But what is really reassuring for me is that because we are aware, like I've actually listed as a volunteer, so I've got full access to the portal. I can actually see everything that's in the DFAS portal and the resources that they have access to, the training that they do. And so I can then connect those associated controls, their training, their standard operating procedures, their operational circulars that go out and things like that. So I think it's well worth having access to that. The other thing is, DFAS now and then talking to the SESM or the district officer, if you wanted copies of the training needs assessment for your brigade, I'm sure that DFAS would be happy to supply that, which gives you an idea of how trained up your members are for those systems within DFAS. Okay, of the local government grant scheme funds that we receive for our bushfire brigade, we actually give a third directly to the brigade in 2 payments, $5,000 each time. We've developed a great relationship with the brigade, and we actually give them the autonomy to manage their own PPC and PPE purchases and their minor operating costs. So these are the things, as you can imagine, for a bushfire brigade member, their greatest concern is having the right gear. And so they purchase those things within the parameters of the local government grant scheme manual and the eligible items. They've got access to the ineligible list. They can see that. And so we've been doing that now for 10 years. We do the same with this SES. And it works really well because they work really hard and it's nice for them to be able to buy the stuff that they need. It also helps them manage the recruitment process. They understand if they spend all that money, they can't just keep getting in more members. So, and they can't just give a new set to everybody that walks through the door. So it's really important for them to have that kind of tryout period to see whether these members are really the right fit. And the other thing I've just mentioned there, managing expectations and enthusiasm. So many of the members are extremely skilled. They're tradesmen, you know, they're professionals, and they're more than capable of doing a lot of the things that a local government employee or contractor might do, and they want to do it. And 50 years ago, at the old shed there on the left, they did do it. They built, our volunteers solely built that shed on their own, and it was the lower half, the lower side of the building. The next section, the higher part to houses 3, 4 was added later. So they used to have a lot of free rein in terms of building and construction. New shed there on the right. They weren't allowed to touch anything on that. But what is important is that we engage them throughout the whole design, construction and maintenance process. They got to pick what colour tiles, what colour shed, what colour tin, what colour roof, whatever they wanted. We talked about it. We gave them the choices within the parameters that we had and the budget that we had. In terms of funding also, obviously, and the response for that when there are issues, we have regularly engaged LGIS through our finance team. I just go direct through finance, and they're our conduit to LGIS in relation to any queries that we have in terms of any minor incidents or anything like that. Okay, so this stuff is just an example of how we've been doing things over the years. Happy to share them. Emma did say, has talked about us integrating them into a WALGA standard, rather than everybody have to kind of adjust some of our documents, it may be that we have a chat to Emma and we actually develop these as a standard WALGA tool that can be rolled out. So these resources are all available. We're happy to share. Also down the bottom there, you can see that there's we do have job descriptions for the FCO, Deputy Chief and Bushfire Control Officers. That also includes minimum training standards that we believe that they should have in order to be appointed in those positions. Again, a bit of butt covering going on there. The Brigade Constitution and our Bushfire local laws. So I will have a chat to Emma as to our approach, but if you are interested in any of these resources, feel free to email me on that email, emergencymanagement@mandra, and I can let you know on how the process is going to go. So I just wanted to lastly say, acknowledge the incredible efforts of all our bushfire volunteers who really do dedicate an extraordinary amount of time to saving life and property. And I really wanted to thank our district officers at DFIS who have supported us throughout the years, demonstrating that we really all are on the same team, supporting the bushfire volunteers to build capacity and to return home safely. Thank you.
Maura, thanks for that. I mean, I'll speak on behalf of the room here. It was incredibly instructive to hear, contextually what happens on the ground. So we really value your contribution, and in particular hearing about the work you do in terms of sharing those learnings across other local governments. And that's exactly what this session was intended to achieve today. So thanks very much for that. Look, we have got a number of questions that we had submitted previously. We don't have a lot of time, so we'll just try to get to a couple of them. And I'll note in advance that they do have an operational focus, and I think the panel will probably expect that will be the case. And the first one I'll ask, and I'll probably look to Richard and maybe Scott to make some comment here, because it touches on fatigue management, but also due diligence. And this question comes from one of our country shires. Currently, we're not checking if our volunteers are fatigued when they arrive to fight a fire. As an example, a farmer may have just completed a long session in the harvester when a fire starts near his property, and he responds when we call him or her out. We have no visibility of the fatigue levels under the new legislation. To what extent are we exposed in these circumstances should that farmer be injured due to his or her fatigue? So I'm happy to leave one or other.
Want me to have a crack first?
Yeah, Matthew, go for it. Thank you, mate.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. It's certainly one that, as an agency from a DFIS health and safety perspective, we are looking at all the measures that we can put in place to help understand and manage fatigue. Interestingly, I won't jump too much into the legal space, but there has been around Australia some recent cases in relation to this. And one of the things about fatigue is no one else knows your level of fatigue. So we're going to check back into the shared responsibility area. So a worker, we touched a lot on the obligation of the PCBU, but we're also going to default back to the shared responsibility and the obligation of the worker in this instance, and this would be our volunteer, to actually acknowledge at what level of fatigue they have. And they may well turn out and go to the incident initially, but it's about then the time that they put in, what the duties are that they're doing, and really encouraging an understanding and level of training that when they reach a level of fatigue, that they notify those that are in control of the incident and adequately withdrawn out of there. So we're going to say, yes, there is an element of still shared responsibility. From the LG point of view and the PCBU, that comes in those early stages, again, information, instruction, training, and the supervision and the knowledge that that is a shared responsibility. So systems, obviously DFIS, we are looking, really in depth about what systems we can help when we're around and tracking fatigue and everything else like that. So hopefully, so that's from my area, whether Scott's got something defaulting.
I guess, look, it's legal and practical. You're 100% exposed is the short answer. You own them, they're your employee, but that's relative in terms of reasonable practicability. So pull it back to that. It falls on the PCBU, and certainly I can say that in the first instance, what will occur is that the regulator will go for the PCBU. They're the ones that should have a system in place for dealing with this thing. That's how that will work. It will filter down to the worker if all those things are in place. Absolutely everything. It's really rigorous. Everything's in place, and in blatant disregard of all of that, the worker does something that's egregious. like lie, knowing full well that could result in a fatality or an injury. Very unlikely for that to occur. However, as you say, they're very, very keen. So it's about managing expectation. It's about making sure you've got a system in place. What's reasonably practicable? It's not to do a sleep study on everyone when they come in, but it is reasonably practical to have a checklist. Have you had X amount of sleep? And for you, what is your cutoff? What's your risk appetite in relation to that? And you need to feel comfortable saying no to people. That will also go for prolonged events, and we need to consider prolonged events, not just initial turnouts where a person has driven 3 hours to get there or come off the back of a normal workload. So yeah, 100% the liability in the first instance still sits with the PCBU, but there are reasonably practical measures that can be put in place that don't have to be ridiculous to deal with this. But they do.
If I can just add to that as well, the handbook that we have produced for local governments to provide bushfire volunteers also has a section in there in relation to fatigue, and does highlight the need for them as an individual and their individual duty of care to ensure that when they are presenting themselves, they are essentially fit for the activities and not fatigued, and that it's okay to say no. So again, just to confirm what you guys have said, it is about being practical, but it's also around education and awareness and conversation with the brigades.
Thanks very much, Emma, and thanks for those contributions, Scott and Matt. Perhaps we'll just close out with one last question, and it probably loops us back around to a topic that a number of the presenters covered off on today, and it is in relation to training. So in some respects, I think this has been covered, but perhaps one final comment would be really useful. Again, this comes from a country shire CEO who indicates that a number of members of their shire's bushfire brigades are reluctant to attend training, and they're concerned about how they can comply with their WHS obligations in this situation. So is there a final word perhaps we could have from a number of the presenters on advice they would have for local governments under those circumstances?
For me, I think we've seen a benchmark set that it is practicable, that it is reasonable. That I think the big one out of the takeaway today for me is this legislation is around how important it is just to engage and consult, right? And the training aspect. Now that hopefully there's awareness, there was a great presentation there by Paul about all the resources and all the mechanisms that are available. And if we break it down, does all of that have to happen at once? The answer is no. Do we have to put in a system where we can manage that and understand, the risk against the reality of, what the risk profile may well be? And so small elements of training, but I think at the start again, really important that we consult with the volunteers and the members that come in, understand what their profiles are, and maybe even tailor those training packages, knowing what's available for you. And I think that's a really reasonable way to be able to do it. And a risk management profile around that and understanding them in the first instance is how I would approach it, Nick.
Great, thanks, Matt. Anybody else want to make a comment?
I'd just say, going on from what Matt said, is that having been a local government chief in a small country shire and a local government chief in a large metro shire, the important thing was to make sure we had documented. So this is the standard we accept, and stick to that standard. So that's probably the only comment I'll add on that.
Thanks, Paul. Emma, do you want to make a comment?
Yes, please. Thanks, Nick. So with regards to training, we know the challenges, but we need to make sure they're competent. Okay, so training is just one way to do that. There are other ways that we can assess people's competency levels, but we need to be mindful to select what's reasonable and what's practical for what you actually need in terms of your brigade. Be realistic and plan. And as we said, there's lots of resources and assistance that's going to be helpful for you. I think there are a number of positives from this webinar, and a number of positives with the brigades. You know your brigades, utilise them, talk to your brigade captains. We're here to help in terms of resources, in terms of advice and guidance. We've got some time to plan, and now's the time to look at what those gaps are. And I can see the questions, And yes, there's lots of questions, and I've been looking at this for 8 months, so none of them are a surprise to me. But the main thing is that we need to plan. There is help, there are resources, and we need to be realistic about what we can achieve. But there's already lots of great work happening out there. So let's build on that capacity.
Thanks, Emma. And just to Scott for the final word on that.
My one's really quick. Thanks very much for that. The answer to that is, are you comfortable with that? If they had to turn out, are you comfortable that that person, if you're owning that responsibility and that risk, can you put a hand on heart and say you're comfortable for them to turn out? If you can't, and you're not comfortable with that, then you need to stop and think about it. And it's the same as if you were put on, if the question was posed to you by a coroner after the worst possible thing occurred and said, at the time beforehand, were you comfortable that this person was trained and competent? You need to be able to answer yes. And if you can't do that, have a think about how you're going to address it.
That's great. I think that's a pretty important message for us to finish the webinar on. So I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank all of our presenters. You've been incredibly generous with your time. We really appreciate the preparation you've put in. And I'd also in particular like to thank all those attendees who have taken the time to participate this afternoon. We really hope you've got some value out of that. Look, this is just the start of a conversation that we're going to be having and continuing between local government, their volunteers, DFES, and obviously other key stakeholders as we all strive to ensure the safety of our bushfire volunteers. I'd like to acknowledge LGIS and their contribution, obviously, to the session today. And I'd just like to let everybody know that WALGA is in the process of developing a survey to better understand the experiences of local governments in managing their emergency management responsibilities. So we'll be coming to you, Myra, and working with volunteer Bushfire Brigades. Information regarding the survey will be circulated to the sector shortly. I'd like to very quickly acknowledge the WALGA team who have assisted putting this together this afternoon, Nicole, Susie, Cass and Susan. And thank you all again for your participation. We really hope there's been some value in this. And as I said, this is just the start of the conversation. So thanks very much again.